The blizzard howled through the night, snowflakes like shards of glass slashing across the cabin windows. Maya Daniels, a widowed nurse and mother of a 4-year-old boy, was laying another blanket over her sleeping son when a low, distant rumble stirred the silence. At first she thought it was thunder, but the sound grew louder, steadier, a chorus of engines fighting against the storm. Through the frost-etched glass, she saw a wavering line of headlights crawling along the snow-packed road. 35 motorcycles, their riders hunched low, struggling against the biting wind. Minutes later came the desperate knock, hesitant, then urgent. When she opened the door, the blast of icy air carried faces pale with cold, lips trembling, eyes pleading. Her neighbors would later call it reckless, even dangerous. But in that moment, all she saw were human beings who might not survive the night. She stepped aside, letting them in. She didn't know that by dawn. The snow-laden hills would thunder again, this time with the arrival of more than 1,000 riders. Maya had moved to the small Montana town 8 years earlier with her late husband, David. They had chosen the quiet wilderness for peace, not realizing that small-town life could sometimes feel less welcoming than the coldest winter. Though they never faced open hostility, there had always been a subtle distance, the lingering stares in the grocery store, the way conversations sometimes hushed when they entered a diner. When David was killed in a logging accident 2 winters ago, Maya became the only black single mother in the sparsely populated valley. She poured her energy into caring for Caleb and her patients at the rural clinic. Her cabin, built by David's hands, stood on the edge of a pine forest a few miles outside town. Winter had never frightened her, but the storm that swept through in late December was like nothing she had ever seen. Meteorologists called it a once-in-a-century blizzard. By the second night, the roads vanished under drifts as tall as fence posts. The power flickered in the town, but her cabin's wood stove kept the small rooms warm. Caleb had fallen asleep early that night, curled under a patchwork quilt by the fire. Maya stood at the window staring at the wall of white beyond the glass when she heard it, the faint, distant growl of engines. At first she thought she had imagined it. Then came a faint beam of light cutting through the swirling snow. More beams followed. The sound rose into a stuttering thunder that shook the wooden walls. Her pulse quickened. Out here, strangers arriving at night in the middle of a blizzard could mean trouble or tragedy. She turned down the lantern so as not to be seen too easily, then pressed her face to the window. The figures appeared slowly out of the storm. They were covered in snow and ice, shoulders hunched, faces half hidden behind fogged visors. Their motorcycles crawled along the road like exhausted beasts. When the lead rider swung off his bike and trudged up the short path to her porch, Maya's first instinct was to bar the door. But then she noticed his shaking hands as he knocked, the slight sag of his knees as though he might collapse. She opened the door just enough to peer out. "Please," the man rasped, voice raw from the cold. "We've been riding for hours. We just need somewhere warm." For a heartbeat, she hesitated, hearing the echo of all the warnings she had grown up with, about strangers, about men in leather vests, about being a lone woman far from town. But then she saw the others behind him, some limping, others holding their arms against their sides for warmth, all of them shivering violently. She thought of Caleb asleep by the fire and of the bitter wind outside. Whatever fears she had about them paled beside the threat of freezing to death in the snow. She opened the door wider and said, "Come in, all of you." By midnight, 35 riders huddled in her modest cabin, thawing by the fire while she served them hot soup and tea. She didn't ask where they came from. She only made sure no one's fingers turned blue. By dawn, whispers had already begun in town. A trucker who had passed by in the night had posted a photo online, headlights glowing outside Maya's cabin. The caption read, "Local woman takes in biker gang during storm. Hope she's safe." In a community already frayed by suspicion and old prejudices, the image became fuel for gossip. Some worried for her safety. Others muttered darkly, "What's she thinking letting them in? She's got a kid in there!" The sheriff, an aging man named Ron Whitaker, drove up in the early morning, snow chains rattling against his tires. He found Maya's front porch stacked with boots drying in the icy air, the inside of the cabin lit by a dim but steady fire. Through the window, he saw the riders sitting quietly, some with steaming mugs in their hands, others resting their heads against the wall. Nothing in the scene matched the town's worst assumptions. He knocked gently, stepped inside, and nodded to Maya. "You doing okay?" he asked. She nodded. "They were half frozen," she said. "I couldn't turn them away." The sheriff took a long look at the men, then left without incident. But not everyone in town was as understanding. At the diner that morning, where ranchers and shopkeepers gathered to swap storm stories, the talk turned sharp. "She's putting all of us at risk," one man grumbled. 35 of them today, what happens tomorrow? They'll take over the whole valley," another lowered his voice. But not enough. Figure someone like her would side with outsiders over her own neighbors. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Maya tended to the bikers as if they were patients. She wrapped frostbitten fingers in clean bandages, handed out her last packets of instant soup, and stayed up through the night, keeping the stove fed. The oldest among them, a broad-shouldered man named Hank with a faded scar down his cheek, told her quietly that they had been riding across the region for a memorial event. The storm had caught them on an open stretch of highway, forcing them to push forward long after they should have stopped. They had lost track of some of their group who had fallen behind in the whiteout. Hank's voice cracked as he said, "If we hadn't found your light, we might have frozen out there." As the sky lightened, the storm eased just enough to reveal the road. That's when the distant sound of engines came again, louder, deeper, more relentless. Maya stepped onto the porch, holding Caleb against her hip, and saw what looked like a river of lights far down the highway. Her breath caught. It was not just a handful of bikes this time. News had spread among the riders' extended brotherhood that some of their own had been stranded. Hundreds had ridden out as soon as the storm began to ease. Now they were arriving, wave after wave, the line stretching back into the hills. In the town below, panic flared. Rumors spread faster than the truth, that the bikers were preparing to retaliate against locals who hadn't helped, that the cabin was becoming a stronghold. Some people locked their doors. Others grabbed their hunting rifles and stood watch at windows. Caleb clung to his mother's coat as the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath the approach of hundreds of motorcycles. Maya felt her heart pounding, but stayed on the porch, determined not to show fear. When the first riders stopped in a broad semicircle outside her cabin, engines still idling, the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks again. The convoy finally stilled, engines settling into a heavy rumble. The riders dismounted in near unison, their breath visible in the icy air. The sheer number of them, leather-clad figures stretching up the snow-banked road, was enough to make even the sheriff hesitate when he pulled up behind them. From the front rank stepped a tall, broad man with a steel-gray beard and calm yet piercing eyes. He moved slowly toward the cabin, each boot crunching in the frozen snow. Maya held Caleb close, though the boy peeked out from her shoulder, wide-eyed and curious rather than afraid. The man stopped a few paces away and removed his gloves. For a moment, he studied her, the silence so thick that even the wind seemed to pause. Then he said in a voice deep but steady, "The ones you sheltered last night. They're my brothers. We thought we lost them." He glanced back at the group huddled behind him. "They told us a woman, alone with a child, opened her door when no one else would. You saved them." One by one, the riders behind him pulled off their helmets. Some nodded silently. Others lowered their eyes as though acknowledging a debt too outstanding for words. The man gestured toward a trailer at the rear of the convoy. It was piled high with food, blankets, firewood, and boxes of winter supplies. "We came to help, not to harm," he said. "We figured if a stranger could show that kind of humanity, the least we could do was show some back to you. And to this town." The sheriff stepped forward then, exhaling a cloud of steam as if finally releasing a long-held breath. He gave Maya a brief nod before turning to the townsfolk who had gathered at a cautious distance. "No trouble here," he said. "Looks like we've all got some learning to do." The tension that had gripped the clearing began to ebb. The hum of engines softened as more riders switched theirs off. Maya, her breath still fogging in the frigid air, managed a small, grateful smile. For the first time since the storm began, the valley felt a little warmer. Over the following days, the storm's grip loosened. With roads still buried under snowdrifts, the convoy didn't just wait idly. They fanned out across the valley, digging out farmhouses, delivering firewood and food, towing stranded vehicles. At first, some townsfolk accepted the help stiffly, as though unsure whether it came with strings attached. But when they saw the riders hauling supplies to an elderly couple's house at the far end of the road, or clearing a path so a rancher's cattle could reach shelter, their wariness began to crack. Maya mainly kept to her cabin, exhausted but relieved. Every evening, she cooked simple meals, soups and bread, and offered them to anyone, whether a biker or a local, who stopped by to warm up. Caleb grew fascinated with the big bikes and often watched them from the porch, waving shyly when the riders passed. When the roads were finally cleared enough for the convoy to move on, the bearded leader approached Maya one last time. He shook her hand firmly and said, "You reminded us what brotherhood really means. Not just for us, for everyone. No reporters showed up to capture the scene. No viral videos told the world. But in the quiet of that valley, something had shifted. The townsfolk who had once whispered doubts about Maya's place among them began to see her differently. A few days later, the widow who ran the general store stopped by with fresh bread and said softly, "I guess we all misjudge things." Maya didn't seek praise. She only wanted Caleb to grow up knowing that compassion mattered more than fear. One evening, as they stacked the last of the donated firewood behind the cabin, Caleb asked, "Mama, why did you let them in that night?" She smiled, brushing snow from his coat. "Because when someone's freezing," she said, "you don't ask where they come from. You help." The story lingered in the valley long after the snow melted. Old prejudices didn't vanish overnight, but they lost some of their power, softened by the memory of a storm that had forced everyone to rely on one another. And for those who later heard about the night a single mother opened her door to strangers, the question that echoed most was simple yet profound. If it had been us on that freezing night, would we have done the same?